Hello there, and welcome to another best practice video. My name's Stephen Wade. I'm the head of event content here at IR Magazine, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Ned Coletta, who is the Chief Financial Officer at Casella Weight Systems. So thank you, Ned, so much for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Hi, thank you, Stephen, for having me. I appreciate it today.
Brilliant, that's great. So one of the reasons that we wanted to speak to you today and that we invited you here was to really understand how you've adapted to the challenges that 2020 has thrown up, and get a good sense of some of the best practice that you're putting into your IR program as you look ahead to the next sort of 12 to 18 months as well. And a good place to start with that would be to understand, in your opinion, what is it that has characterized the last 12 months for you from an investor relations and an investor communications perspective?
Yeah, and you probably hear this from a lot of people. There's pre-COVID, COVID, and now the world after. And leading up to COVID, I felt that we had a really heightened sense of ESG. And, many of even our longstanding investors were ramping up efforts, including at BlackRock and other premier firms, to really start to measure ourselves and others more diligently with that lens. Then COVID hit, and it was really just how to communicate in a very dynamic environment, given Reg FD and a lot of disclosure requirements. And then I think post is just a sense of how do you imagine the future? And I come from an industry and a business where I typically can see the next 12 to 24 to 36 months very accurately. And I can't do that with all customer segments today. So giving the level of transparency, data, metrics that can allow investors to do their own modeling and their own risk analysis has been important over the last few months.
Yeah, absolutely. And at the start there, you mentioned ESG as well. Have you noticed a renewed focus on ESG? Have you noticed any sort of changes in 2020, perhaps, whether that's a focus on more of the S and the social issues of ESG? What have you sort of observed in that regard?
Yeah, I think when the second week of March hit, I don't think I heard the term ESG from a single investor until maybe the first week of August. It was almost like it went away. Now, it never went away from what we do as an organization, because our company was built, especially on the E side. That's been what we do for 45 years as one of the premier resource management companies in the United States. We've been recycling since the 70s, and it's just part of who we are. And then on the social side, it's a huge part of the fabric of our organization. We're in communities across the northeastern United States. We have deep roots, supporting local organizations, supporting our people in the organization. So it's interesting. It almost felt like people had forgotten about this really key way of looking at organizations and measuring the risk in many ways of your organization within a broader context of just financial numbers. And it's come back in. I think since we reported a great second quarter and investors really saw the sustainability of our earnings and the resiliency of our business model, that long-term dialogue has reemerged very, very quickly in a meaningful way. And I think it's reflected in a company's numbers during a time of stress like that. We are an essential service provider who continued to operate throughout COVID. Communities where we operate, regulators, politicians, all had a great deal of support for us and what we do, and our people were quite proud about what they did during this period. So it's interesting. I don't think it's really a fad. I think it's a way of really helping to measure how a business model fits in today's day and age.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you sort of mentioned about the initial kind of impact, and everyone's looking, going back to square root, and ESG is kind of being put on the side from an investor perspective, but it's come back. So even though attention was focused on one bit, now there's a big focus, particularly on that social aspect, which is really interesting. Now, one thing I'm also really intrigued to hear from your perspective is just, what the role has been for senior management. So how important is it at times like these for senior management to kind of get out there and, even though it's not physically on the road, sort of get in front of investors and talk to them at a time like this?
Yeah, it's really been something I've done throughout my career. I've been very accessible to investors. For the 15 years I've been involved in finance, investor relations, and the last 8 as a CFO. And I'm always accessible on email, text, the phone. People can reach me any time of the night, and they laugh about it. But we've always been on the road, once or twice a month, out meeting with people face to face. And this lifetime of Zoom now and WebEx, and I think it's working okay right now. But I feel like it might even work better with people we've built relationships with over time, where they know us well, they have a lot of trust for us, they know how transparent we are. With new investors getting involved, it's a little harder, I think, to get up to speed. Sometimes when I'm in meetings, I'm drawing diagrams or writing numbers for people and explaining things in ways I feel like you can't get some of the non-visual cues as easily as well. And we're doing the best we can. One positive that I think has come out of this whole experience is I'm seeing that we're getting better accessibility to maybe investors we wouldn't always see. So more European investors. I felt like we would spend a lot of time in New York City or Boston or Chicago or certain markets, and now I see more diversity, and even some markets I've never met with investors from, like Australia and whatnot, it seemed to be engaged. And so maybe there is some huge benefits as well that we'll recognize.
Yeah, absolutely. The world has just got a little bit smaller in a way and more connected, which brings new opportunities, but also new challenges. So it's really interesting to hear about, how you go around onboarding those new investors. And you sort of mentioned about making notes or drawing charts
Yeah.
and trying to explain things that way. Are you employing any other kind of additional virtual tools to help communicate some of those issues when you're kind of in a digital environment?
Not yet. I think we really should, but what I'm finding is we've been participating more either just in our normal phone calls with investors or whatnot. And then when we go to virtual conferences, the intensity and speed is even higher than when you're at in-person conferences. So you're like on the half an hour, on the 45 minutes, you're barely making it from meeting to meeting. And we haven't been able to take advantage of trying to do, like sharing my screen or doing things or more electronic content or virtual tours. And I think if this lasts much longer, we're going to have to get more creative in those areas. Investors over time have loved to come tour our facilities and meet more of our team and understand on the ground what we're really doing. And that's one area we're definitely missing right now.
Yeah, no, two really great points there. So one on the time limit, in terms of there's no longer a shepherd's crook when you've gone over the time, but it's just a click of the button and you're out. And that's really interesting when you've got operations, when you've got big facilities, and people need to understand the technology and what sets you apart. How you're going to be able to kind of communicate that virtually. So we'll have to keep up to date with you with regards to that.
Yeah,
Final.
we talked, sorry, this morning we even talked about that in our management meeting. We're going to start doing some drone tours, more multimedia, and it was actually more centered to many of our community partners. because we always invite the community into our facilities and say grade school kids into recycling facilities to learn how it all works. And that accessibility is not here right now. So I'm looking to those same tools to bring to the street as well.
That sounds brilliant and really creative. And yeah, you'll have to keep us up to date with how that all progresses. And yeah, I mean, for a lot of the investor relations professionals, and obviously you've got a long experience in IR, you know, what advice or what tips would you have to IR teams when it comes to making the most of the senior management team and your time when it comes to that investor communications aspect?
I've always been a big fan of just straightforward communication. I mean, I love it when sell side analysts or investors just are matter of fact and to the point, and we have great open dialogue and lots of transparency, and that's how we've tried to conduct ourselves over time. There's never a spin on anything we do. We try to get the facts out there in a transparent, uniform nature over time. We've also, our strategy's been very consistent for a lot of years. Our communication with things for investors, nature of the questions and move through them effectively. And, it's probably a bit of our industry as well, because there aren't huge changes that happen every day, and we're able to be much more consistent and uniform over time. So it's probably helpful compared to some of the challenges others face. But in our space, I learned a long time ago that it's fun to have new strategies, fun to have new communication, ways of saying things and new slides. But many times just that bland consistency over time gets us a lot further. It's definitely helps, I think, with our communication. We can today, I think most of our shareholders can say back to us exactly what our key strategies are and where we are, and it's so consistent. It doesn't confuse people. So we spend more time on the key topics and key metrics.
Yeah, absolutely. So don't overcomplicate it.
No.
Keep it simple and keep it consistent. That sounds great. And in terms of operational changes, so changes to your the way that you do investor relations, what are the short-term changes that you've made, and are any of these going into the long term as well?
In the short term, I mean, one of the hugest short-term changes we made early was removing guidance, like a lot of companies. And I don't usually disagree with our broader team and our board on many topics at all, but this was one where I didn't even think it was a good idea to remove guidance. And we ended up doing it back in May after our first quarter earnings. And I resumed guidance in the second quarter, where I really believe very clearly that guideposts for investors, guideposts for analysts, and for our management team are super important. Many years back, I would put out 3 to 4 year strategic plans to our investors. And we've done that over the last few years. We put out a 2018 plan. Back in 2015, we put out a 2021 plan to investors. I'm a big fan of putting out longer range frameworks, financial guidance, and it's what we get compensated on as a management team. Investors know exactly where we're headed over time. So that was a tough one for me, removing guidance for a period of time. I intellectually got it why we should do it. We didn't know where the world was headed, but that's one of the important ones that I'm glad we have back in place. It's just such an effective communication tool to make sure people are modeling in a correct manner and really understand what the management team thinks we can do. Not being able to meet people in person, as we talked about earlier, I think it will come back at some point. I just think there's a level of relationships that are built with on the buy side that's so important over time. And I've really gotten to know a lot of our investors. They trust us and we trust them. And I think the Zoom's interesting, but I think the meetings will come back, and it is an important long-term place to be. And as we talked about a minute ago, we do need to get more creative, I think, in how we can get communication on electronic formats more effective, and maybe some tours and things like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that sounds great, and fingers crossed more sort of in-person meetings when it's safe to do so, obviously. And yeah, final question is really, in your perspective, what do you think are the hallmarks of great investor relations, whether that's across the sector or across the market as we head into 2021?
I I think the number one is just transparency and keeping the same tenets that each one of us built our programs on over time, where our core values are extremely important to us as an organization, and we live those internally, and we also live them externally in our communications, and just making sure that we keep accessibility. We try to make sure there's clarity in what we're doing. Back in early April, when things were changing very rapidly around us, I was asked to do several virtual events. And, there was a definite Reg FD compliance issue in my mind, talking about where we were real time with COVID, where we were with numbers. So we scrambled and put together the best we could, an instant viewpoint on where our business was, put out an 8K. and, and things were changing. We told people things were changing, but here's a viewpoint on who we are, where we are at this moment in time. And I don't want to suggest that you should put earnings out more often. It's hard enough quarterly and more viewpoints. But in dynamic points in time like that, getting more information to shareholders and making sure you're upfront so people can assess their risk, I think is truly important. And we've tried to do that the best we can during this period.
Yeah, I can really tell that transparency is kind of a core sort of value for you, and evidenced by the fact that you've reinstated the guidance, and yeah, that message that you delivered around consistent, simple communication, so that your investors really understand what it is that's happening at your company. So there's some fantastic bits of advice. I'm sure they'll be really valuable for everyone watching this. And thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to have a chat, and fingers crossed we'll be doing it in person and hearing all about your new drone tour that's coming out. So Ned, great to speak to you, and thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks.